Today's program is titled The Women Who Didn't Love Men. A nod to the novel The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, originally Men Who Didn't Love Women. The original title suggests that a man should love women, right? A man who doesn't love women is seen as less of a man. There's a moral expectation that men love women, that being a good man is somehow tied to how he treats or feels about women. But is it the same the other way around? It doesn't seem so. Women are allowed, even encouraged, to have an identity independent of men. In fact, if a woman hates men, not only is it tolerated, it's often supported, celebrated even. But if a man, not even hating, just criticizing, speaks negatively about women, he's instantly accused of being bitter, insecure, or misogynistic. It's like men are expected to love women unconditionally, no matter what. And if they don't, they've somehow failed as men. That's where the irony kicks in. The meaning of the phrase completely changes depending on the gender. The women who didn't love men versus the men who didn't love women. One is provocative, the other is expected. That alone should make you think. Let me put it another way. Imagine I said, women deserve to be loved as much as they love men. Sounds nice? Not really. It drips with irony. And ask yourself, why? It's because deep down, everyone knows it's not true. Nobody expects women to love men. Women know they don't love men that much, and men know they know. So if you tell a woman you deserve to be loved as much as you love men, she only has two choices. Pretend not to get the irony, which is almost impossible, or realize that if men only loved women as little as women love men, that wouldn't be good for her. So that phrase exposes something uncomfortable. If love were truly reciprocal, if men loved women only as much as women love men, women would lose out. And deep down, they know it. You won't find a woman who hears that phrase and feels flattered, because honest women know female love toward men is lacking. A brutally honest and selfish woman might respond, no, women deserve to be loved more than they love men. Because she knows that's how it already is, and she fears losing that advantage. But that's exactly what makes it a powerful thought experiment. If you tell a woman, women deserve to be loved as much as they love men, she'll pause. She won't know right away if it's a compliment or an insult. And what determines that isn't the tone, but the truth behind the second half of the sentence, how much they actually love men. Anyone honest or smart will immediately recognize the problem. Because if women loved men as much as men love women now, women would end up with less than they're used to getting. That sentence forces people to confront a reality they'd usually rather avoid. It's one of those lines, like Bilbo's in The Lord of the Rings. I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. At first it sounds polite, but unpack it, and it's a backhanded insult. Except this phrase about love goes even deeper. It forces the listener to ask whether they give what they expect to receive.
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
The common cultural explanation for why men might be lonely or rejected or, celibate somehow deserve it.
Oof. That's blunt.
It is. Women are simply exercising good judgment when they choose not to be with a particular man.
Okay.
A man's loneliness is seen as proof of his failure with women and, by extension, his failure as a man.
Wow. So it's not just about relationships. It's about his fundamental worth as a man in that view.
Not only is the women who didn't love men a concept we culturally accept, without question we actually justify it.
Huh. So we don't just accept it, we actively find reasons for it.
If a man is unloved, it must be because he's unworthy, not kind enough, not confident enough, not attractive enough.
So the fault is always internal to the man. His characteristics, his actions.
The immediate go-to explanation in society when encountering a lonely or single man, the problem is assumed to be with him and his character or capabilities.
If a man is alone, the immediate societal reaction is to look at what he did wrong or what he lacks.
Exactly. It places the onus and the blame squarely on the man, framing his relationship status as a direct reflection of his personal failures or undesirable traits.
Precisely. Reduces a complex issue to a moral judgment that flatters women and blames men, without actually engaging with the reality of gender dynamics.
Okay, so it oversimplifies and assigns blame in a way that favors one side.
This explanation allows women to claim a kind of moral high ground, the idea that they are simply making discerning choices based on male inadequacy, while conveniently ignoring the true underlying drivers of the issue.
Which are?
Men aren't lonely because they mistreat women, which it disputes entirely as a primary cause.
Okay, so not because they're bad partners universally.
No. Men are lonely due to fundamental gender differences in needs and sexual capital women have, and because women don't like men as much as men like women.
Wow, okay.
Or-
That's a completely different angle. It radically shifts the cause from individual male behavior or supposed worthiness to systemic gender differences in desire and leverage within the dating landscape.
Exactly. So the problem isn't that men are universally bad partners or failing individually, but rather that the fundamental dynamics of attraction and the dating market itself are structured in a way that works inherently against men, leading to this outcome of widespread male loneliness.
The system, not the individual man, is the primary culprit. Is that fair?
That's precisely it. Gender differences in desire and leverage as the actual reality of gender dynamics.
Yeah.
The default explanation completely overlooks or intentionally ignores because it's a comfortable lie.
A comfortable lie.
Yes, men aren't lonely because they mistreat women. They're lonely because women don't value men the same way men value women.
Yeah.
The core issue is a fundamental disparity in how men and women regard each other, particularly in a romantic or relational context.
And for you, our listener, understanding this initial really sharp contrast is important because it sets the stage for everything else.
Right.
It challenges a widely held belief, the idea that men's loneliness is purely a result of their own actions or shortcomings, and prompts a deeper look at the underlying dynamics as seen through the lens of this text.
Yeah.
It's asking us to consider a different kind of explanation rooted not in individual male failure, but in inherent gender differences in desire and market value and how society processes this.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into that core claim we just touched on. Women don't desire men as much as men desire women.
Right, that fundamental difference.
It's a fundamental biological or maybe sociological truth driving everything else.
Okay.
This deep difference in desire directly to concepts like sexual capital and leverage in the dating market.
Sexual capital leverage.
Yes, because women have this lower level of desire compared to the very high level of desire men have for women, they inherently have far more leverage in the dating world and can find partners more easily.
Leverage. That's an interesting, almost transactional way to frame something as personal as dating.
In this market, supply and demand work brutally against men. Supply of men who are considered highly desirable by women is relatively limited compared to the massive demand from men for female partners.
Okay, makes sense in that model.
And because of this imbalance, women hold the dominant position. Women have all the leverage, and it creates yet another layer of power imbalance, one we don't dare acknowledge publicly.
So its power dynamic is significant, but also culturally suppressed and maybe denied.
Yes, it's something powerful but unspoken.
So this imbalance isn't just theoretical, it has real difficult consequences for men navigating the dating world. What does this leverage means for the average man?
Men have to tolerate more rejection, more indifference, more conditions just for the chance to be chosen.
Tolerating more? Just for a chance.
Yes. Men operating from a position of inherent weakness in this market. Having to accept less favorable terms, maybe overlook negative behavior, or jump through more hoops simply for the possibility of entering or maintaining a relationship. This dynamic forces men into a position of constant effort and vulnerability.
And this imbalance goes even deeper, right? Beyond just the initial dating phase.
Yes, this dynamic leads to a situation where women don't value relationships the same way because they're always available to them.
Because of that leverage.
Relationships for men are hard to get, cost significant effort, risk, rejection.
So relationships are seen as a high effort, high risk, low availability investment for men, while for women, they are readily accessible commodity. That's a really stark contrast.
Precisely. And most of what men can only access through romantic relationships, women get easily from their circle of friends, emotional support, validation, even affection.
Women have other avenues for these needs.
Women have alternative, non-romantic avenues for fulfilling core emotional needs like intimacy, validation, support, that men are primarily socialized or driven to seek only through romantic partners.
Right. Which would make the relationship itself less central, maybe, for those needs.
That's what the source argues, yes. It further reduces the perceived necessity or urgency of a romantic relationship from the woman's perspective, because many of those needs are already met elsewhere, unlike for men.
That's a significant point about the perceived difference in where emotional needs are met. It reinforces the argument that women have less inherent incentive to prioritize or compromise within, or even fear the loss of romantic relationships,
Right.
because they have these other readily available sources of support, unlike men who are more dependent on a romantic partner for such needs.
Right. And it directly links back to why women don't value relationships the same way.
Makes sense.
If relationships are consistently available due to leverage, and many core emotional needs are met elsewhere through friends, their perceived value, or maybe the fear of their absence, might be lower compared to men who struggle significantly to get relationships and rely on them more heavily for core emotional support and validation. It creates a system where one side needs it more and one side has it more easily.
It's a pretty stark picture of the dating and relationship landscape. It's a market with significant power disparities driven by differing levels of fundamental desire and perceived relationship availability.
Yeah.
Makes you consider, does this perspective on dating market dynamics resonate with anything you've observed or experienced in the world?
It's a question worth asking yourself. Moving on, who gives more in relationships once they've formed?
Right, after the dating market part.
Yes, men often give more in relationships emotionally, materially, and in terms of effort and sacrifice. Men give more in every way than women do. This isn't just about financial contributions, although that's often part of the discussion. Men consistently invest more across the board.
Okay.
Emotional effort and sacrifice. Men are more likely to love unconditionally, to stay loyal even when things aren't ideal, and to keep showing up.
Men's love as steadfast, resilient, less dependent on the partner's current state or the relationship's circumstances.
Conversely, women are more likely to love based on condition status, emotional stimulation, financial security, or whether their expectations are being met at that moment.
Conditional love based on needs being met right now.
Yes, women's love often lacks loyalty and depth. It's not unconditional.
So men's love is a default, a constant, a stable presence, while women's love is something that can be withdrawn or lessened if certain potentially ever-changing conditions or expectations aren't being met. One is inherent, the other is transactional.
Exactly. And links back to the perceived difficulty men have in obtaining relationships in the first place, which we discussed earlier.
The scarcity thing.
Right. Because relationships are hard for men to get and perceived as conditional from the female side, many men live with a quiet, constant fear, specifically the fear of being left.
That makes sense. If something is hard to acquire and you perceive it as potentially conditional or easily withdrawn, you would naturally be anxious about losing it and might feel compelled to constantly work to prevent that loss.
Right. Men, driven by this anxiety, bend over backwards, turn into doormats just to keep a woman around. Men constantly striving, often to their own detriment, and frequently over-compromising to maintain a relationship that they fear could end at any moment, precisely because they perceive it as conditional and hard to replace.
And this directly connects back to the earlier point about relationships being always available to women.
Precisely. Due to their higher leverage and other sources of support, remember.
Right, the friend networks providing support.
Because relationships are so readily available to women compared to men, they don't fear loneliness the way men do. Why would they? Women have readily available emotional support, validation, and even affection outside of romantic relationships, significantly diminishing their perceived need for or fear of losing a romantic partner compared to men who lack these alternative avenues and see romantic relationships as their primary source for these crucial needs.
A stark and, well, challenging contrast in men's and women's approaches to love and relationship. Men give more unconditionally and live with a constant fear of loss because relationships are scarce and perceived as conditional for them, while women give conditionally and don't fear loneliness due to the perceived abundance of options and alternative emotional support structures.
Yeah.
It's a perspective that flips some common narratives about who is the more committed partner,
Shifting focus now to dynamics within relationships, the power imbalance, it continues even after a couple is together and building a life. In most households, it's the woman who sets the rules.
How so?
The woman often decides what counts as being thoughtful, what counts as doing your part.
Yeah, defining the terms of contribution.
Yes, a situation where the woman unilaterally defines the standards for acceptable behavior, contribution, and even the methods for accomplishing tasks within the household. It's not for negotiation, but a unilateral setting of norms.
And if the man doesn't meet her specific, maybe unstated or changing expectations, or do things precisely her way, what happens? What's the typical response or accusation?
He's often accused of negative traits or behaviors, specifically being labeled as lazy, selfish, or, using a term that's gained cultural traction, accused of using weaponized incompetence.
Ah, weaponized incompetence. That term has been around a bit. Does it mean the man is actually doing it deliberately?
Well, not necessarily, but rather as an accusation levied by the woman when the man simply doesn't adhere to her specific methods, standards, or timelines, even if his way is equally effective.
So just doing it differently gets labeled negatively.
In these situations, it never crosses her mind that her way isn't the only valid one, and suggests this accusation arises because she is so used to the man adapting to her, not the other way around.
As a symptom of that deeper power imbalance.
The man is expected to conform to the woman's preferred way of doing things, and any deviation, even if unintentional or just a different valid approach, is reframed negatively by the woman, often as a deliberate attempt to avoid responsibility, or as a character flaw like lazy or selfish, when it might just be, well, a different way of doing things.
So this section highlights specific power imbalance in the daily negotiation of shared life within a relationship.
Right, in the nitty-gritty details.
It suggests that within many relationships, one person's, specifically the woman's, methods, standards, and timelines are implicitly or explicitly prioritized, and deviations by the other partner, the man, are often framed as character flaws or laziness, rather than simply different valid ways of approaching tasks. It's a micro-level example of the macro-level power dynamics.
Exactly. A microcosm of the larger power dynamic between genders, driven by that initial imbalance in leverage and desire, played out now in the mundane details of managing a household, where one partner's way is the standard and the other's is potentially pathologized if it deviates.
Okay, let's address a topic that's often front and center in discussions of gender dynamics: objectification and exploitation.
Right.
Common complaint heard frequently. Women constantly complain that men use them for sex. Some do.
Okay, so a point exists.
Yes.
Yeah.
But this common complaint is only one side of the coin. What's rarely acknowledged is that women use men for everything. For sex, for money, for emotional labor, for protection, for attention, for status.
Everything. Money, labor, protection, status.
A vast range of interactions and resources, yeah.
Women's use of men is more complete, more strategic, and arguably more exploitative.
Arguably more exploitative than men using women for sex. More complete or strategic?
While men might primarily focus on sexual utility, though again, it acknowledges this happens,
Right.
women see men not just as bodies, but as comprehensive resource providers.
Okay.
Men are seen not just as bodies, but as ATMs, bodyguards, therapists, emotional punching bags.
ATMs, bodyguards, therapists, punching bags. Wow.
This portrays men as being valued primarily for their financial resources, their ability to provide physical safety or security, their willingness to absorb emotional distress, and their availability for attention or validation, rather than their inherent selves or complex personalities.
This instrumentalization covers a much wider range of needs than just sex.
The scope of this perceived use is far wider.
Those examples paint a picture of men being used for a wide range of utilitarian purposes, almost like a multi-tool for a woman's needs.
Yes, despite the emotionally complex and draining nature of this perceived one-sided dynamic, for the man constantly being expected to provide these various resources and emotional labor, women drop men without hesitation the moment they stop being useful.
That's colder, more calculating, and far more cruel than the complaint of men using women for sex.
Women engage in a broader, more strategic, and emotionally detached form of utilizing men for multiple resources, and that the willingness to discard men when they are no longer useful as a particularly harsh and calculating form of exploitation.
Yeah.
It's a perspective that challenges the conventional narrative around who is primarily being objectified or exploited in gender dynamics. The focus should be wider than just sexual objectification to include economic, emotional, and security-based forms of utility. It forces us to consider different forms of value exchange in relationships and which ones might be considered more or less exploitative.
Okay, now let's return to where we started. That initial cultural claim that men are lonely because they treat women badly.
Right, the default explanation again.
We know this is not only untrue, it's damaging.
Yes, this idea is a comfortable lie that shifts all the blame to men and avoids any accountability on the other side.
So not just wrong, but as a convenient way to avoid looking at other factors.
Exactly. It's saying this narrative functions to protect one side from criticism by placing all fault on the other.
But some women might genuinely believe this.
Some women are stuck in a pattern. They go after the bad boys.
Ah, the bad boys trope.
Yes. The men who were rewarded over and over again with attention, sex, and affection despite their bad behavior.
Rewarded despite bad behavior.
So the specific subset of men who treat women poorly but are nonetheless successful in attracting them.
Ah, okay. So the women who are most vocal about being mistreated by men are often the ones who have repeatedly chosen partners known for treating women poorly. Is that the connection?
That's the irony. After being hurt or mistreated by these specific bad boys, the men who were successful despite their poor behavior, women then don't take it out on the specific men who caused the pain. They take it out on men in general.
Taking it out on men in general, like a displaced anger thing.
It's a process of displaced anger and projection, yes.
So a form of collective punishment, where negative, painful experiences with a specific subset of men are then projected onto the entire male population, regardless of individual behavior.
Exactly. The blame disproportionately falls on men who have barely been part of the dating pool, who had few or no relationships, who kept to themselves, or even simply the entire male gender, generically.
So the men who aren't even involved in the dating scene much.
Precisely. The men who actually caused the pain were often rewarded with attention, sex, and relationships, seemingly escaping this collective blame.
While the blame falls on.
Meanwhile, the men who are blamed are often those who have been unsuccessful in dating or relationships, including celibate men, men who have never dated them, touched them, or mistreated them.
That is a sharp and quite cutting contrast.
It really is.
The blame for mistreatment in relationships is fundamentally misplaced, directed at men who haven't caused the harm, including those who are already isolated and unsuccessful in dating.
Right.
While the actual perpetrators seem to escape accountability and even benefit from the system. The narrative of men treat women badly, therefore men are lonely, gets the causality and the targets of blame entirely wrong.
Yes. It was a misdirection of blame resulting from a pattern of choosing partners who fit the bad boy mold.
Okay. Let's move to a topic just to illustrate broader societal double standards related to gender and blame. Misandry versus misogyny.
A very charged comparison.
Indeed. Misandry, or the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against men, is far more socially acceptable and widespread than misogyny, the equivalent prejudice against women.
More acceptable and more widespread.
Looking specifically at online behavior and reactions, misogynistic comments, when they appear, rarely get widespread support. They are usually condemned or ignored.
Okay, so anti-woman comments get shut down, basically.
In contrast, misandric comments, they go viral. They racked up likes, retweets, hearts, applause.
So anti-man comments get celebrated and amplified online.
This stark difference in online reception, one condemned or ignored, the other celebrated and amplified, is evidence that there are way more women openly hating men than men openly hating women, and that this open hatred towards men is significantly more socially sanctioned.
So the popularity, positive reception, and amplification of anti-male sentiment online is proof of its greater social acceptability compared to anti-female sentiment.
Yes, significant difference in how openly and proudly these sentiments are expressed by individuals.
How so?
Many women are proud of it. They'll even call themselves misandric publicly, without shame. They embrace the labels.
Women are proud to call themselves misandric publicly.
And how does this so contrast that open embracing of misandry with the perceived societal reaction if a man were to call himself misogynistic?
Let me guess, not the same reaction.
No. That if a man called himself misogynistic, he'd be torn apart, called trash, treated like a failure of a human being, a failed man.
Wow. So immediate and severe condemnation.
Yes. There is a severe and immediate social cost, leading to ostracization and condemnation for a man expressing misogyny that simply doesn't exist or exists to a far lesser degree, for a woman expressing misandry. A man expressing hatred for women is socially condemned, seen as fundamentally flawed, and stripped of his perceived value.
Whoa.
While a woman expressing hatred for men can be openly proud of it, celebrated, or seen as empowered without facing the same level of social backlash.
The argument about a man's societal value being tied to his relationship with women, but not the reverse for women.
Yeah.
Society, both men and women, tells a man that his value as men is related to his relationship with women, but it doesn't tell the same to women. But women aren't told they need men to validate them. Again, sick on a tell and aren't.
Got it. This fundamental difference in how society values men and women, where men's value or standing is perceived as linked to their success with or acceptance by women, while women's value is not seen as dependent on men,
Right.
is the root cause of this double standard in how misandry and misogyny are treated. Because a man's societal score, in a sense, is linked to women, rejecting women, misogyny, is seen as rejecting the very source of his value, making it catastrophic. But because a woman's score isn't linked to men in the same way, rejecting men, misandry, doesn't undermine her societal standing.
Exactly. And that changes everything about how each gender gets judged and excused.
Changes everything.
This fundamental societal imbalance in how value is assigned based on the need for validation from the opposite gender creates an environment where misandry is tolerated, celebrated, and even encouraged online and in culture.
Right.
While misogyny is fiercely condemned and punished, leading to unfair judgment and gender-based excuses in public discourse. A differential valuation of men and women creates this disparate treatment of prejudice.
Okay, just to pull it all together.
Good idea.
We've explored its fundamental challenge to the idea that men's loneliness is due to them mistreating women, arguing instead it stems from fundamental gender imbalances in desire and dating leverage.
Right, the core premise.
We've looked at the idea that women's love is often more conditional and less loyal than men's, driven by relationship availability.
The conditional versus unconditional love point, yeah.
We've examined the power dynamics within relationships, arguing the woman often sets the rules and uses accusations like weaponized incompetence when men don't conform.
The household rules dynamic.
We delved into its challenging claims about objectification and broader exploitation. Women use men for a much wider range of resources, money, protection, emotional labor, and discard them based on utility, which it sees as more exploitative than men using women for sex. And finally, we dissected misandry versus misogyny, arguing that a societal double standard rooted in how each gender's value is perceived creates an environment where misandry is tolerated and widespread while misogyny is condemned.
That covers the main points.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this perspective that diverges significantly from mainstream narratives.
And here's maybe a final provocative thought based on the ideas presented for you, our listener, to consider.
Okay.
If societal value and dating market dynamics fundamentally differ based on gender, with differential leverage, conditional versus unconditional approaches to love, and disparate societal judgment based on gender, what are the broader implications for how we understand conflict, blame, and perceived unfairness within male-female relationships and in wider societal gender discourse? How might these underlying dynamics reshape our interpretation of common complaints and conflicts between genders?
That's a complex question. It strikes at the heart of how we interpret interactions and disagreements between men and women.
It does.
It asks us to consider whether conflict is always about individual behavior or if it's rooted in deeper, unacknowledged structural dynamics. We encourage you to reflect on the ideas presented and, form your own conclusions.